Hello everybody, this is Manu S and welcome to another Eternal Contenders video series. Today we're gonna talk about the Felon Scream Reanimator, first piloted by Team Eternal Warcry during the Team League Week 2. The base skeleton of the deck has been around for quite some time, but the deck was lacking pieces before and the new set provided a lot of missing pieces to turn it into a real contender from like a fringe brew before. And Eternal Warcry realized that and tried to capitalize on it during the team league. I think the main creator of the deck in their team, as far as I know, was the Overmaster, building it and like working on it together with his teammates for the event. Okay, so I'll put some work into the archetype myself because I liked the archetype and the idea and had it like on the back of my head that I wanted to try and prove something like that after experimenting with other Reanimator decks like the Harvard Reanimator that my friend Dr. Hu gave me. And yeah, Nocturnal Observer clearly was a great card for these types of decks. But yeah, I kind of forgot about the whole Felon approach until Eternal Warcry yeah, brought it to the team league, and I quickly started working on my own version and changing and fixing the things that I thought they got wrong, but they came up with a pretty strong core and skeleton that the deck relies on. But enough for the long introduction, let's get to the deck. Okay, so this is the deck list. This is what I'm currently running. First of all, let's talk about the deck and the core of the deck real quick, and then I'll explain some of the differences and my card choices. Alright, so I would say the core of the deck are 4 Haunting Scream, 4 Sporefolk, 4 Vara's Favor, 4 Direwood Beastcaller, 4 Gorgon Fanatic, 4 Nocturnal Observer, 4 Rindra the Duskblade, 4 Grasping at Shadows, probably at least 2 Snowcrush Animist, and 4 Vara Fate Touched, and in total with the favors I would say at least 30 power. The rest is just support material, removal, enabling, whatever you can or want to fit in there. Basically, the Haunting Scream plus Direwood Beastcaller Fanatic package gives the deck a really strong early game and sort of a nut draw, and I win the game draw, because if you play a Sporefolk on turn 2, milling one of these guys, and then just Haunting Screaming them back turn 3 at your opponent, especially the Beastcaller, that will beat a lot of decks on their own. I've got plenty of concessions by just Beastcallering on turn 3 or turn 4 on the play, and my opponent immediately conceding because they cannot beat it. And that is also very important against aggressive decks, because aggressive decks are the ones that scoop the hardest to an early infiltrated Beastcaller, and that's a great way of winning against them. Gorgon Fanatic is just your kind of value engine. It buys you time and buys you resources, which is exactly what this deck wants in a lot of scenarios, because if it has time and enough resources, it can do so many powerful and broken things that overpower most of the things other decks can do in the game, and that equals you win eventually. Sporefolk is just great at enabling Haunting Scream and Grasping at Shadows, while also providing some early game blocking and the Shadow unit later to use with Vara. For example, what happens sometimes is you, on turn 7, Grasping at Shadow back a Vara, and then Sporefolk or Haunting Scream to trigger her right away again, stuff like that. Nocturnal Observer is just a great card that helps you get rid of situational cards. It helps you get Haunting Scream targets in the void for turn 4 Haunting Scream. It allows you to trigger Knight for Rindra to gain more health with the lifesteal, or simply discard one of your fatties for your Grasping at Shadows, or just get rid of excess power, some more business. It's just a great versatile unit that afterwards also blocks reasonably solid as a 2-3. Rindra is just more enabling for Nocturnal Observer, so you get to loot more. Also great at stabilizing the board, or even stabilizing the life total by gaining health back, or simply pressuring a reactive opponent and forcing them to react to you while you work towards a powerful later game. And then Vara is just the heart of the deck, it's the late game of the deck, it's the main Grasping at Shadows target. And Snowcrush Animist is the secondary Grasping at Shadow target. When you're behind or against aggressive decks, this can win the game on its own, especially like turn 5, Grasping at Shadows on an Animist beats a fair share of aggro decks on the spot. And also with Vara, it's one of the better things to get back, aside from like Haunting Screamed units with charge and flying. And it also helps you eventually end the game later by just stunning their entire board and killing them over 2 turns. And yeah, that brings me to the cards that are not necessarily core and not that obvious. Like, first of all, we had only, I think, 4 removal in the Eternal Warcry list. I think they had like 4 cost removal and like 2 Annihilate, which is not remotely enough. The best way the deck loses is by just getting beat down, run over. And more removal, especially more cheap removal, definitely helps with that, which is why I added more of it. One of the things they had was Strategize, and I think it just doesn't do anything for you, really, in the end. It's kind of like decent card filtering, but the problem is it doesn't even let you discard the card you don't want, so it doesn't synergize with the reanimation stuff. It rather like puts the cards on the bottom, and a lot of the time the card you want least in your hand are cards you want in your void, like your 8-drops, for example. So you're forced to put back cards that you might actually want. Like most of the cards you either want or you want in your void. There's not that many cards you want to put on the bottom of your deck. That's one of my problems with it. The other is it's very slow and dirtly. And the deck has a powerful late game, it has decent card selection. All it needs is to stay alive and not be run over. And playing Strategize early on is the best way of just getting run over and dying, especially against more aggressive decks and aggressive mid-range decks. So those had to go. The other thing they had were some Herald Song. They are fitting a bit better than Strategize, but they are arguably even slower. And the deck, I found, usually is good enough at getting stuff in the void between Observer and Sporefolk, or simply just playing your infiltrators and having them die and then Haunting Screaming them back, or eventually getting to 8 with all the card draw from Fanatics and Observer and stuff to play your 8-drops naturally. In the end, I didn't feel the deck can afford the slots once again because it's too dirtly. Sure, maybe you could cut like 1 removal for 1 Herald Song, but they had 2 Herald Song and I'm not even sure if I would want the second. And unlike in the Tavard Reanimator, where you have Privilege of Rank, Herald Song is also a lot less powerful and slower here, because in the Tavard Reanimator you could theoretically at least use it to save 3 power on the Privilege and just get your power drops, while here you're just spending 2 power on minor card filtering and get a decent way to set up your Grasping at Shadows a bit more, which you usually don't need, I found. I messed around with stuff like Levitate, because it seemed a lot better than Strategize to me, for sure, because, like I said, one of the better ways to beat aggro is just Beastcaller them, and Levitate is both a cantrip and a way to enable your infiltrators, make them better, force your opponent to have an answer to them, and just play the typical Haunting Scream game early on, which is actually quite good against aggro. But the thing is, the Levitates didn't play out as well as I hoped, and a lot of the time they were just kind of 1-power cantrips. And I ended up just being beat down too often and felt like the early game is too inconsistent, too fragile, and too flimsy. So I cut them, and Ceres and I talked about like wanting Permafrost. He kept the Levitates at first when he added Permafrost, because he absolutely wanted them when he started trying deck, and just cut Annihilates for Permafrost, which is something you cannot do because the deck is shut down reasonably well by Titan, because Titan is so good against Haunting Scream, denying you your Haunting Scream advantage, that you definitely want Annihilate to have enough outs against Titan. And since the Haunting Scream game is a pretty important part of the deck, so Permafrost is not gonna cut it there. Also, yeah, Annihilate being a fast spell can also be relevant and so on. So yeah, I didn't like that swap, but I agreed that Permafrost is probably better than Levitate, and yeah, gave up on the Levitates because I was unsatisfied with them and turned them into Permafrost. And that brings us to the deck where it is right now. I also added another Deathstrike. I think the original list had 4 Strategize and 2 Herald Song, which I basically replaced with 6 removal. Or it had like 3 Strategize and 2 Herald Song, I think, and 2 Harbingers, and I cut the Harbingers for a Beastcaller because they only had 3 Beastcaller for whatever reason, which I think is very wrong because, like I said, the card is just very, very powerful and wins games on its own, and it's just not right to not play 4 once you play Haunting Scream and ways to enable it. And also Permafrost often has a similar effect on, by the way, on your infiltrators as Levitate has, because it's not so easy for your opponent to have 2 blockers up early on. So a lot of the time Permafrosting their blocker is about the same as Levitating, except it gets rid of the blocker instead of drawing your card, which is arguably better, especially if you're infiltrating a Fanatic, which sets you behind on board, where you really don't want their unit to be still around. And yeah, I cut the Harbinger simply for space concerns. It might be wrong, like maybe, I don't know, the deck should cut a Permafrost and an Annihilate, or 2 Permafrost or something, to try and fit 2 Harbingers, or maybe even a Permafrost and an Animist for 2 Harbingers or something. Because Harbinger can be nice, it can gain you back some health and can wipe minor boards, but I just felt it's not that good. Like they had only 2 Animist, and I rather had more Animist, because having Animist often enough is really powerful. There's a fair share of scenarios where you're rather grasping at Shadows and Animist on turn 5 than a Vara, so I really wanted to make sure that the deck is fairly good at having an Animist early on. So I felt like 3 is a good number. 3 felt like a pretty good number most of the time in the Tavert deck as well, and that deck was better at finding it than this one is due to Tavert. So yeah, I wanted 3 here, and Harbinger seems a lot less impressive, I think, once you have more early game, and once you have Rindra to gain health back, that the Tavert deck didn't have, which is why the Harbinger was more important there, I think. But yeah, I can see Harbinger being worthwhile. And then we have just 3 Deathstrike and 3 Annihilate, like 10 removal, 3 removal for Tavro type cards, which is definitely important. They had and I had initially Feeding Time, but Overmaster suggested that Deathstrike is better because you can sometimes kill your own Animist end of turn and then bring it back on your turn to win the game, which he said mattered more than Feeding Time being Feeding Time. And I guess being fast generally has nice upsides, and I could see that being right, especially with like little other matchups where Feeding Time matters that much. It mostly matters in the mirror and against like Dawnwalker. And Dawnwalker, it doesn't even like that big of a problem for a deck like this anyway, and there are not many Dawnwalkers right now. So yeah, this is the removal suit. This is like the current makeup of the deck. Basically, if you want to mess around with some of the numbers in the deck, I can only see messing with the removal and like the 1 Animist at best. The rest I would not touch, and I would probably also not go below 6 to 8 removal at least, and probably 5 to 6 removal against Titan. Like, I don't think you can play less than 3 Deathstrike with Tarbrod being as rampant as he is, and at least 2 or 3 Annihilate. And then you have the Permafrosts to mess with, and the Animist. In terms of the power base, I think they had like 1 or 2 Seek power, which I think is overkill, given that you have 12 duels now. The color requirements of the deck are actually not that heavy, and the power base is reasonably slow between Crests, banners not always being supported, and seats not always being supported, so there's no need to put like an Evolving Wilds type card in a deck with this much fixing, basically. Like, if you compare it to Magic, for anyone that plays and knows Magic, you would not really put like an Evolving Wilds type card in a 2-color deck with these color requirements that already has 12 dual land. Because the cost of making your draws clunkier and slower is just much bigger than the gain from that 13th mediocre fixing card that you might not even at the time. Also, they had 4 Amethyst Waystone, 0 Cobalt Waystone, and too many Shadow sources. So Rindra on turn 4 could be tricky, for example, and the deck was more prone to just being like color screwed on Primal some hands. And I felt like Cobalt Waystone is a great addition to the deck, both because it blocks the Steward of the Past summon trigger, silencing everything that already is in your void. So if you have that up, they can play the Steward, but only everything that dies after the Steward is gonna get silenced, which is a big deal. And the other thing is, it just prevents you from being burned out by aggro decks. It's that much harder for them to finish you off with a Torch or an Obliterate. So it's definitely worth having. And Amethyst Waystone, first of all, the more you have, the more likely you're gonna play the first one without a trigger. So it's not really that much of a loss to go down by one. Second of all, the card is pretty hit or miss, like against aggro. Having to play these with a trigger, sometimes because you need the power, but it's your only power source, can actually like be very detrimental and cost you games. And yeah, in the spirit of balancing the deck more against aggro, I cut 1 and 1 Shadow Sigil, I think, for 2 Cobalt Waystone. Made the deck a bit better at having Primal, and also a bit better against like burn to burn you out, and incidentally also against stuff like Steward. And make it a bit less likely that you have to Nightfall to make a power drop, since I really had mixed feelings about the Waystones. Sure, they are nice for Observer and sometimes for Rindra, but they can also be really, really bad for you. So I feel like 2 and 3 is a good split. And then yeah, you have just like your 12 duels, and with like 19 Primal sources, and the deck mostly being single Primal outside of Rindra and Animist, and for Animist it doesn't really matter, so it's basically mostly Rindra. The color requirements are very well met, and even for like a turn 4 Rindra, the 19 Primal with the Scout from the Crest and the extra card draw the deck are pretty well met. Sometimes you cannot play Rindra on turn 4, which sucks a bit, but I think the only way to improve that would be to cut another Amethyst Waystone for a Cobalt Waystone, which might be reasonable, but the Waystone draw and Nightfall enabling for those 2 cards is fairly good and helpful in the deck in a fair share of matchups. So so far I wanted to keep 3 around, but I could see cutting 1 and adding a Cobalt Waystone. Alright, that's it for the deck list. That was a pretty long explanation, but yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about and fine-tune in this deck, so I hope that was helpful to everyone. And yeah, I quite like the deck. The deck is the real deal. It's a real contender. It's probably a pretty solid to good tier 2 deck, but probably but not a tier 1 deck. But yeah, who would have thought that a Haunting Scream, Grasping at Shadow based Reanimator deck would become a good tier 2 deck anytime soon before set 3 dropped. So that's pretty cool. Like the last set shook up the game pretty well, gave us a bunch of cool and surprising new archetypes, and added a bunch of nice dimensions to the game, I think. Alright, that's it for the deck tech. As usual, gonna hop into some games in ranked with this to show it in action, show you how to pilot it, and show you how we're doing. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the first game coming up.